That is not the point of H.R. 40, the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. For hidden in the corners of this nation are those of African American heritage, the descendants of enslaved Africans who have felt the sting of disparities. They continue to feel that sting. Now more than ever, the facts and circumstances facing our nation demonstrate the importance of H.R. 40 and the necessity of placing our nation on the path to reparative justice. That is what H.R. 40 is about. Clearly, we require reckoning to restore national balance and unity. The government sanctioned slavery, and that is what we need. A reckoning, a healing, reparative justice. We need to bring our nation together. And this commission is really, it is no figment of your imagination. It is a commission that will be appointed by the majority leader of the United States Senate, the Speaker of the House, the President of the United States, a commission that will be funded for fact-based hearings, the opportunity for all people to be heard, and then, yes, a reparative healing of proposals to deal with the questions of the starkness of the life of African Americans in this country. Like our last hearing, the minority has selected 2 African American witnesses to speak against H.R. 40. That is their privilege. But we know that justice, facts, and that life that was led and continues to be led by African Americans is on our side. Their selection, however, fails to undermine the overwhelming support for this legislation and merely demonstrates the multiplicity of views within the Black community. To conclude, I ask my colleagues to recognize that what we speak of today is based on the continuing impact of the brutality of slavery. And as I close, I need you to take a look at what I offer to put into the record. This was our life, the back of a beaten slave.
One can't castigate Mrs. Lee too much for her wishful thinking. After all, the world she's living in is colored in all respects by her politics, and with so little time at her disposal to study American history seriously, it is no surprise she has no understanding of the facts underpinning her statement that the photograph she holds up, for the record, as her evidence of what slavery was in antebellum America, shows the back of a beaten slave. And of course, to provide her with her prop, that is precisely why the New England Abolitionists of 1863, Henry Ward Beecher, publisher of the New York Independent magazine, William Lloyd Garrison and his Boston Liberator newspaper, the Harper's Weekly, and Olivia Childs, the National Anti-Slavery Standard newspaper. And finally, at the end, is sort of the coup de grace, comes Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. These abolitionist rags promoted the story of poor Peter being brutally whipped by an overseer gone berserk somewhere in Union General Benjamin Butler's theater of operations in December 1862. The slave's condition coming to light when he came within the Union lines in the spring of 1863. Hello to you, I'm Joe Ryan, and as those of you who know, who've been here before, the presentations the channel offers the audience are based strictly on my experience as a trial lawyer trying cases in the trial court to jury verdict. The consequence of this is that the presentation must be fact-driven evidence-driven, not result-driven, not driven by political agenda or attitude or prejudice. It must conform to the strictures the trial court provides in the admission into evidence only of those documents and things which are based on objective facts required by the rules of evidence, rules that have evolved through 1,000 years of English common law. With these rules, then, as the presentation's guide, with 40 years' experience in dealing with them, in the reality of the trial court, I can tell you that nothing that now exists in the available historical record of Mrs. Lee's story of poor Peter's back having been beaten would be received by the court in evidence, except, first, the photograph she waves in our faces, and second, the opinion of a qualified medical doctor of what probably was the efficient cause of the scars the photograph shows us is on the African's back. The obvious reason why the photograph itself is admitted into evidence is that it plainly shows to all reasonable persons the image of a real person, where the photograph was taken, when it was taken, what is the real identity of the person shown in the photograph. However, these are factual questions which can only be provided by other admissible evidence, such as a witness's testimony that from his personal knowledge he knows and can identify the person shown by the photograph, and a witness testimony that from personal knowledge he knows when and where the photograph was taken. These are details which I will cover later for those of you who stay. For now, it's enough to say to the rest of you that what is necessary to establish what probably caused the scars you see in the photograph is to call a qualified medical doctor to the stand. Show her the photograph and ask whether she has an opinion what caused the scars we see on the African's back. Some weeks ago, when I saw Mrs. Lee waving the photograph during her speech on the Democrat House Committee on Reparations, I had just had a minor surgery performed by a dermatologist named Jennifer Herman. I had no previous relationship with Dr. Herman. I had never met her. I had never retained her as an expert in a case. She was a total stranger to me. Mrs. Lee's use of the photograph prompted me to dig into the record, to understand the objective facts as I would do in preparing any case for trial. And after exhausting my ability to gather up all the facts for presentation to you, I met with Dr. Herman to remove the surgical sutures, and as she was completing the task, I casually produced Mrs. Lee's photograph and, showing it to Dr. Herman, told her nothing more than the photograph was 150 years old, dating from the Civil War, and I asked, what in your opinion caused the scars? And, taking it in her hand and looking at it, she answered, acne. I said, acne? I've seen images on the internet of acne scars on the back, but nothing like this, I said. She replied, acne? The scars are too irregular to be accounted for by a whipping, unquote. Now, during this entire time, the two of us are standing there with masks covering our faces. I had never seen Dr. Herman, without the mask, so I did not know then how attractive a lady she is. Nor did I know until I asked her for her opinion and went to the internet did I know that she had graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University and holds her medical degree from Harvard Medical School, that she completed her residency training at the University of Alabama, where she pursued a postdoctoral fellowship in subcutaneous oncology, where she pursued a postdoctorate fellowship in cutaneous oncology and was awarded the Walter P. Little Award for Excellence in Dermatology. And she served as chief resident during her final year. And that she completed her Mohs Micrographic and Cosmetic Surgery Fellowship at the University of California under the direction of Dr. Roy Gherkin, a leader in the field. And that she has received numerous research grants, has lectured to colleagues and the public on skin health and cancer, and has published more than 20 peer-reviewed studies and book chapters. What a thrill of discovery, folks. Back in the day, in real time trying lawsuits to verdict, to get your hands on such a professional expert to testify in court was a gift sent from heaven, though it would cost your client thousands and thousands of dollars to get her on the stand. So, with Dr. Herman's opinion, evidence admitted by the judge, leaving what weight to give it to you, the audience, I have made the prima facie case that as a matter of objective fact, the scars we see on the African's back were not caused by a brutal whipping, as the abolitionists living in 1863 proclaimed, but were caused by acne. Now, in which event, to avoid the judge granting my motion for a directed verdict on the issue of causation, Mrs. Lee and her crowd have the legal burden now of producing admissible evidence which is sufficient for the jury to find the contrary fact, that the scars were caused by whipping. Of course, to meet her burden, Mrs. Lee will search about for a medical doctor willing to testify as she wishes reality to be. And it will be the duty of the jury, you the audience, to decide which doctor's credibility carries the more convincing force. All right, now let's examine the abolitionist's contribution to the photograph becoming, as the Atlantic Monthly magazine touts, one of the most powerful images from the Civil War. First, let's set the stage with a quick summary of the military situation, as it was in the Union Army's theater of operations in Louisiana in the spring of 1863. In early January, Ben Butler, commander of the department, was relieved and replaced by the Bobbin Boy, Nathaniel Banks, both Massachusetts men. Banks took command of the 3 divisions of the 19th Corps, some 17,000 men, which were then concentrated about New Orleans and across the southwestern parishes of Louisiana. The 1st Division, composed of 3 brigades commanded by Christopher Auger, a New York man, was at New Orleans preparing to occupy Baton Rouge and probe the defenses of the Confederate fort at Port Hudson. By the middle of March, several regiments of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, were operating on the west side of the Mississippi, between Baton Rouge and Port Hudson. One of these was the 30th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, commanded by Colonel Nathan Dudley. During these operations, Dudley functioned as acting commander of the 3rd Brigade, of which the 30th was a part. The regiment was commanded in the field by Lieutenant Colonel William Bullock. Attached to the 30th Massachusetts at this time was the 2nd Louisiana Colored Regiment, which was composed of Africans who had come into the Union lines at New Orleans in the early winter as contrabands, and were organized in units of soldiers. The 2nd Louisiana was commanded by Colonel Charles Payne. These are all Massachusetts men. And it was this regiment of colored soldiers, along with the 174th New York Regiment and 20 cavalry, that crossed the Mississippi at Baton Rouge and marched north on the west bank to sweep the area clear of the enemy. On March 19, the Union soldiers marched through dense forest until they came to a crevasse filled with water as a result of the Confederates breaking the levee and flooding the countryside, which was flat as a billiard table. The purpose of this was to prevent the enemy from getting to the western parishes bordering the Atchafalaya River. At this point, Payne rode with his cavalry through the water northward. He reached the False River, scouted the countryside, and then rode to Hermitage Landing at the lower mouth of the False River, where he destroyed a Confederate supply depot and he scuttled a steamboat found there. He then went north several miles to Waterloo, a point above Port Hudson, looked for the presence of Admiral Farragut's 2 gunboats, the Hartford and the Albatross, which some days before had run past the Port Hudson guns, saw nothing, and he returned to base. Now, as this operation was going on, Banks had the 19th Corps moving north on the east bank of the Mississippi to invest Port Hudson from the south and from the east. And this occasioned the movement of several brigades into positions between Port Hudson and Clinton. And the Amite River, which runs through Clinton, Louisiana. The distance between Clinton and Port Hudson is about 35 miles. The distance between the Atchafalaya River and Baton Rouge is about 40 miles. This was the situation at the beginning of April, when it appears the African's photograph was taken. How it came to be taken, no one can say with reasonable certainty. What is known as fact is that a team of photographers, McPherson and Oliver, who had been in the business in New Orleans since before the outbreak of the war, had set up a tent in the Union camp in the vicinity of Baton Rouge as the investment of Port Hudson got underway. It appears from the record that the photographers had photographed Admiral Farragut in their New Orleans office on Canal Street, and this contact had given them access to Farragut's gunboats and appears to have gotten them the license to provide photograph services to the Union infantry concentrated at Baton Rouge for the assault on Port Hudson. During these 3 spring months that the siege of Port Hudson took place, the record shows that McPherson and Oliver took photographs of Colonel Dudley, Bullock, and several other officers of the 30th Mass, including a medical doctor named Toole, and also photographs of officers of the 47th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, another regiment in the 1st Division, including its colonel, Lewis Marsh, a Boston merchant. This regiment was armed with Austrian rifles of poor quality, and it was left at Camp Parapet which was located at the eastern outskirts of New Orleans. While the regiment was at Camp Parapet, Colonel Marsh was in charge of the process of organizing the contrabands, as the Africans were called, into labor companies for service in building bridges and causeways through the swamps, repairing broken levees, and digging fortifications. These companies became the nucleus of the 2nd Louisiana Engineer Regiment, and its officers were furnished by the 47th Mass. The 1st Regiment of Colored Laborers was organized at Camp Parapet in late April 1863 and attached to the 19th Corps, 1st Division, and its members participated in the final attacks against Port Hudson in late June 1863. The Democrat press of the day, not then pals of Mrs. Lee's crowd, described the attack of the Africans on the Confederate works as, quote, like tigers. One Negro was observed with a rebel soldier in his grasp, tearing the flesh from his face with his teeth. After firing a volley, they did not reload, but went in with bayonets, unquote. In fact, however, the record shows the Africans inflicted no casualties on the enemy at all. A black newspaper came closer to the truth when it reported that the Black Regiment was placed in front, while veteran white troops brought up the rear. Quote, "Great God, why is this?" unquote, the paper asked. In fact, the Union Army in New Orleans, during the time in question, gathered in the Africans by the process of impressment. One Union general described the process as, quote, collecting Negroes, unquote. One way was sending small expeditions to scour the countryside and collect any men who seemed sufficiently healthy. The other way was press gangs of Union soldiers would sweep the streets of New Orleans, seizing anyone they could, including civilians employed by the Army, prompting from quartermasters protest. As cargo sat on the waterfront and unrepaired levees threatened to give way. You ask if the colored troops are enlisting fast, an officer of a white regiment at Port Hudson wrote to his wife. In answer, he said, quote, "They are enlisting as fast as our folks can catch them with the bayonet. Many of them are deserting every night," unquote. Now, this is hardly surprising behavior on the part of the Africans, as the record is clear that the white Union soldiers did not treat them as equals, but treated them and used them meanly. Every officer and most of the NCOs had one of them as a personal servant. For example, in his diary published after the war, Henry Howell, an officer of the 30th Mass, recorded an incident that occurred during the Port Hudson campaign. Quote, "My Negro was cleaning my pistol today when it went off, and another Negro was wounded in the leg who had been fooling with him. In the melee, a soldier stole the pistol. I caught him, a man from Company B, and I charged him," unquote. Let's look now at the manner in which Mrs. Lee's piece of evidence found its way into the public view. The fact the photograph existed was first published to the public by Henry Beecher's New York Independent magazine on May 28, 1863. This, at the point in time when the Battle of Chancellorsville had just recently occurred and the Army of Northern Virginia was beginning to move toward Culpeper on its way to Gettysburg. And Grant had launched his army in an attack on the Confederate defenses at Vicksburg and had been repulsed. The Independent did not publish the image, but described it and suggested that it be duplicated 100,000 times and spread across the country as evidence of the brutality of slavery, as Mrs. Lee suggests. Then, 12 days later, as Ewell's Corps of General Lee's army was moving from Culpeper toward the Shenandoah Valley, and Grant was digging mines underneath the Vicksburg fortifications, on June 12, 1863, Garrison's Liberator announced that it had obtained the photograph, described the African and his back, and said that copies were made upon request. Here, Garrison makes the first public statement ostensibly identifying the source by which the abolitionists had obtained the photograph. Garrison wrote that the photograph had been obtained from the brother of a person he does not identify. The unidentified person supposedly having sent the photograph to his brother from Baton Rouge. Garrison describes this unidentified person as, quote, the surgeon of the 1st Louisiana Regiment, unquote. Garrison does not identify who this person is, nor is it clear what regiment Garrison is referring to. The 1st Louisiana Regiment might have been the 1st Louisiana Native Guards that was formed in May 1863. This regiment was composed of free persons of color and contraband slaves. Commanded by Colonel Spencer H. Strafford, at some point it became attached to the 19th Corps and it participated in the siege of Port Hudson. The 1st Louisiana might have been the regiment Colonel Marsh of the 47th Mass, formed out of the contrabands collected at Camp Parapet in April 1863. It appears that this regiment did move into the battle space around Port Hudson at some point during the siege and was engaged in labor activities. Several of the 1,000 or so copies of the photograph which were sold by the abolitionists over the course of the remainder of the war exist today. One of these was purchased by a Scotsman in 1864 and taken back to Scotland, where it has been preserved. On the back of this copy of the photograph there is a facsimile for written script fixed to it, which purports to be a, quote, official report, unquote, written by a person identified as J.W. Mercer, assistant surgeon of the 47th Mass Regiment. The writing is dated August the 4th, 1863, and it purports to be addressed to Colonel Lewis Marsh, the Boston merchant and colonel of the 47th. The report states that the writer has seen the backs of many contrabands, and they all look to him like that of the African's back shown in the photograph. But this statement cannot be admitted into evidence as the record stands now. First, no record of a J.W. Mercer can be found in the volumes of the official record of the rebellion that contain all official reports and correspondence relating to the 19th Corps operations in the spring of 1863. Unlike with the other Union officers I mentioned here, no image of a J.W. Mercer can be found on the internet, and no record of any kind can be found which identifies J. Mercer as a real person. You can search through the catalogs relating to doctors in private practice in New England at and after the war, and you'll be hard-pressed to come up with the name J.W. Mercer. So, the first thing Mrs. Lee must do, if she wants the Scotsman's photograph in evidence with its official report on the back, is to find a record to prove Mercer was a real person and not a straw man manufactured by the abolitionists to create evidence to support their interpretation of the marks on poor Peter's back. Garrison's contribution to the abolitionist propaganda was followed on June 20 by Lydia Child's A National Anti-Slavery Standard, which described the photograph under the heading "The Peculiar Institution Illustrated." Then, on the 4th of July, as General Lee's army took up the retreat from Gettysburg and Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg to Grant, the Harper's Weekly magazine published poor Peter's photograph, along with 2 illustrations of what Peter is supposed to have looked like when he came into the Union lines and what he looked like after he was dressed in a Union soldier's uniform. The Harper Weekly calls poor Peter Gordon and tells us this is the typical appearance of the Africans who came into the Union lines. And then it purports to state objective facts. First, that the African escaped from Mississippi, not Louisiana. Second, that he did this by rubbing onions on his body to mask his scent from the dogs pursuing him for, quote, days and nights, unquote. Third, that his supposed whipping occurred on December 25, 1862. Fourth, that between the time he came into the lines, supposedly March 29 to July 4, he had acted the role of a scout in Louisiana, had been captured by the Confederates, beaten, and left for dead. But he recovered somehow and returned to the Union lines. Now, where the editors of the magazine obtained these supposed facts, they do not say. We lawyers, doing our work in the trial court, would be fools to expect the judge to admit this crap into evidence, to prove our case to the jury. In fact, it is probable that the Harper's Weekly illustrator, a man named Collier, may have seen a photograph McPherson and Oliver had taken of 2 young black boys, and drew from this his illustration of the African in tatters. For his illustration of Gordon in uniform, Collier may have lifted it from another photograph McPherson and Oliver had taken of soldiers of the 1st Louisiana standing at ease in the Union lines before Port Hudson. There's also a photograph of a man seated on McPherson and Oliver's tent chair who is dressed in tatters. Who this man is, how he connects, if at all, to the storyline, no one can intelligently say. He's certainly not the same man the Harper's Weekly is showing us as Gordon in its newspaper. Finally, we have Horace Greeley's New York Tribune offering us, as the rag did with R.E. Lee in his story of his whipping Mary Norris, a supposed letter to the editor written by someone identifying himself or herself as, quote, Bostonian, unquote. The letter appeared in the Tribune's edition of December the 3rd, 1863. Whoever Bostonian is, Horace Greeley himself, or one of his editors, whoever, he tells us the following supposed facts. First, that Bostonian brought 2 photographs east from Louisiana in June 1863. One of these shows a black man dressed in tattered clothing, sitting on a chair, being photographed, and the other shows the African with a scarred back, Bostonian says. Second, he tells us that on March 24, 4 Africans escaped from their owners near Clinton, Louisiana. that one of the four was killed in the chase, and that the other three reached the Union lines on April 2, and that the African dressed in tatters was named Gordon, and the African with the scarred back was named Peter, and that Peter was examined in the provost marshal's office, and that Peter spoke French, not English. And whoever interpreted Peter's French into English wrote the interpretation down. And then Peter's back was photographed. And a few hours later, the text of what the interpreter had written down was pasted onto the back of the card containing the photograph. Pretty neat. The National Archives has possession of an album that belonged to Joseph H. Taylor. Taylor was an assistant adjutant general stationed in Washington during the war. He died in Nebraska in 1885. During his life, it appears he collected some 500 card photographs, all of which were images of civilians or soldiers living during the war, with the exception of card photo number 230. Which is a copy of the photograph of poor Peter's back, on the back of which is pasted the text printed by the New York Tribune in December of 1863 and attested to as authentic by this person known as Bostonian. Go figure. Now, notwithstanding the fact no trial judge in America will allow into evidence the Tribune's letter to the editor, pasted to the back of Taylor's copy of the photograph. Let's take a moment to read what Bostonian tells us the interpreter thinks he heard poor Peter say. It reads like a stream of consciousness, doesn't it? Garbled, incoherent, factually confusing. And yet, we trial lawyers have our senses spurred. First, Bostonian tells us the interpreter told him that Peter said in French that he did not actually remember the whipping, which means he either assumed when he became conscious of him, that the scars were caused by a whipping he did not remember, or someone told him when he became conscious of them that he had been whipped. Second, Boston tells us the interpreter told him that Peter said in French that he had, quote, burned up all his clothes, unquote. That at some point he was crazy and tried to shoot his wife and everybody. Now, if we give Dr. Herman this additional history, Peter's clothes were burned. He was crazy. Tried to shoot people. And the history, if we had facts to support it, that Peter might have had an accident in the sugar house during the fermentation of the cane. Would she consider burns from fire or scalding hot fluid as a cause of the scars? Last, having opened his letter with the story being that Peter escaped from his masters at Clinton, Louisiana, on the east side of the Mississippi River, Bostonian then contradicts himself by telling us the interpreter told him Peter said in French that he escaped from the Master John Lyon's plantation located on the Atchafalaya River, which is on the west side of the Mississippi. Here at the last, the abolitionists, for some presently unintelligible reason, get one objective fact straight. A John Lyons, with an S, not an N, did exist in the times. Beginning in 1850, John Lyons appeared in Washington, Louisiana, as a steamboat captain operating steamboats on the Atchafalaya River, carrying bales and sugar and molasses between that place and New Orleans. At some point, as the war years neared, Lyons obtained a 3,000-acre plantation on the Atchafalaya River between Melville and Curtis Springs. In the 1860 census, it is shown he owned some 40 Africans as slaves on this plantation. The census does not show he owned a plantation on the east side of the Mississippi at this time. His wife died in 1863 in a residence he owned in Washington, and he was murdered by a gang of lawless men at his Atchafalaya plantation in 1864. Whether he was the owner of Poor Peter, we have no one to rely upon for proof of the fact than Bostonian, who says he got the fact from the interpreter, who says he got it from Peter. Triple hearsay, ladies and gentlemen, is not admissible under any circumstances in the trial of your case. Then, at the end, we still have one more piece to consider. This is a copy of the photograph made in Philadelphia sometime in 1864. The photographers pasted to the back of the card a reference to a Dr. Samuel Tools, who was connected to Dudley's 30th Massachusetts Volunteers. He, like the others, had his photograph taken in the McPherson and Oliver tent during the Port Hudson campaign. In April 1863, it appears Tools sent a report of some kind to William J. Dales, the Surgeon General of the state of Massachusetts, and enclosed with it a copy of the photograph of the African's scarred back. Dr. Tools remained with the 19th Corps when it was transferred to Virginia in 1864, and he remained in the Army after the war. He provides Mrs. Lee with her needed expert witness opinion, as he describes the scars as caused by a, quote, old whipping, unquote. His credibility would be, of course, under extreme attack in cross-examination, and we can only speculate whether his defense of his opinion would convince the jury to accept his over Dr. Herman's. Of course, what confirms the one opinion over the other is that another photographic example of the condition of poor Peter's back is produced by the experts in their testimony. I'm betting Dr. Herman can do it, and Mrs. Lee can't. Well, what we can certainly say is that Dr. Tools is probably the fellow that started the abolitionist ball rolling.
soldiers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the soldiers gone? A long, long time ago. Where have all the soldiers gone? Gone to graveyards, everyone. When will they ever learn